Electric Pokemon are always interesting to research when I do these guides. A lot of them have very different interactions with their elemental energy. There are those, like the Pikachu line, that are able to generate their own power for the most part. On the other side of that spectrum, though, are the Pokemon that get the majority of their electricity by absorbing it from other sources, like the Magnemite line. Realistically, this is more of a sliding scale than a one or the other situation. Most electric-type Pokemon are able to do both, at least to some degree. And the topic of today's guide is pretty much right in the middle of that scale. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Pokemon Care Guides, where we go through how you would raise and care for different Pokemon species in your own home. Today, we'll be talking about the electric Pokemon species Elekid and its evolutions Electabuzz and Electivire. Elekid is a small, 2-foot-tall, 52-pound yellow Pokemon with a round central body. That's 0.6 meters and 23.5 kilos for those of you outside the Unova region. Like I said, Elekid has a round central body that combines both its torso and its head. It has a humanoid body shape with 2 arms and 2 legs, but the arms are much thicker than its frame would suggest, with no wrist at the end and 3 claws at the end of each arm. On the top of its head are 2 rectangular horns with holes at the top. Really, they look like the end of a plug in the Unova region, which makes me wonder if this Pokemon was the inspiration for that. Before we move on to the others in this line, I should mention that Elekid is yet another baby Pokemon. And unlike Smoocho in the last guide, it actually does fit with the description of a baby Pokemon. Elekid actually has trouble generating its own electricity, having to windmill its arms to try and use the motion like a generator. Which honestly wouldn't be that bad, except for the fact that this tires it out so quickly that it can't do it for long. This isn't a major detriment like with Pichu and shocking itself, but I did want to make sure you were all aware going into this guide that Elekid is classified as a baby Pokemon. After some time, Elekid will evolve into an Electabuzz. Fun fact, for the longest time, this was the only form that was thought to exist in this evolutionary line. It wasn't until we fully understood Pokemon breeding that we were able to find that Elekid exists, and then later on with the genetic research and development of specific man-made evolution items that we found that Electabuzz could evolve again. Electabuzz looks very much like a cross between a large feline and some sort of ape or primate. They still have the humanoid body shape, but the arms are now much longer, ending in large hands. Their legs are comparatively shorter, and they now have a feline tail. Their head is more feline in shape, with 2 large antennae on the top of their head next to a couple tufts of fur. They keep the yellow and black striping from their previous form, though in a different pattern from Elekid. They also get taller and slightly heavier, now standing 3 feet 7 inches, which is 1.1 meters, and weighing about 66 pounds on average, coming out to be an even 30 kilograms. Now, that's where the natural evolution line ends, but if you're able to get your hands on an item known as an electrolyzer, and then send your Electabuzz through a trading machine while holding on to that item, it will trigger a genetic anomaly that was discovered and cause your Electabuzz to evolve into an Electivire. Electivire are massive Pokemon, standing near 6 feet tall and weighing an impressive 305.6 pounds on average. That's 1.8 meters and 138.6 kilos. And when you look at these Pokemon, you can see that the majority of it is all muscle. Electivire is now covered in a shaggy yellow-black fur with muscular arms and legs. It has a wide head with 2 antennae on the top with 2 red eyes. It has gained another tail, and they've changed to be very long and have the look of split live wires, being thin and black with glowing red tips. All in all, they are very unique looking Pokemon, but does that translate to unique and possibly difficult care? Well, let's get into it and find out if these Pokemon are difficult to keep, and if they are possibly the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Enclosure. One of the things that needs to be understood about these Pokemon is that they are very versatile in the places that they can survive. In the wild, they can be found in places as varied as mountains, forests, and even occasionally in old abandoned urban places. So, when you construct their enclosure, you don't have to focus as much on the actual environment that you place them in, so much as you have to make it interesting for them to be there. There should be things and places for them to explore, interesting nooks and crannies that they can get into and find. Really, go with what you already have as to keep the cost down, and then build up from there. Add in things like a handful of trees, maybe a pile of rocks and dirt that your Pokemon can climb up and down, perhaps a small man-made cave if you want. Places that'll keep your Pokemon engaged with their enclosure. All of these adjustments do mean that these Pokemon can, and do, take up quite a bit of space. Elekid, obviously, takes up the least amount of space, being the smallest of the line. With them, you shouldn't need an enclosure that's more than 20 feet by 20 feet. After all, thanks to their smaller legs, they can't really travel around that well. Once they evolve, however, that changes. Electabuzz does move around its enclosure quite a bit, so you'll have to expand the enclosure size for them to 100 feet by 100 feet. That might seem like a major upgrade in space, but these Pokemon are constantly on the move around their territory, looking for places where they can get some electrical charge from lightning strikes or other electrical Pokemon. This leads to them needing to wander around quite a bit in the wild. Thankfully, once they find a consistent source of electricity, such as a power generator or the enclosure that we're going to be building, they stop wandering around as much, so we can somewhat limit how spacious the enclosure has to be. Unfortunately, Electivire is a much bigger Pokemon with the same wandering habits, meaning you'll have to increase the size of the enclosure again to about 150 feet on a side. That is a massive space, but Electivire is a very big Pokemon, both in height and in muscle mass. Not giving them adequate space can lead to plenty of issues. Oh, and for those of you that need them, that's 6.1 meters, 30.5 meters, and 45.7 meters respectively. As for what the enclosure walls should be built from, you want to get something that is resistant to electricity and can withstand blows from these Pokemon, especially Electivire. Here, it will really be a matter of preference. I've seen people say they like reinforced glass, as that allows them to look into the enclosure. I've seen people say they like PVC plastic with a rubber coating, as that's the cheapest and allows for easy electrical distribution. I've even seen people say they like to take the Magnemite approach and go with concrete walls with a steel core. No matter what you decide to go with, the wall should be at least 15 feet, 4.5 meters, tall to prevent the Pokemon from jumping and escaping over them, with a steel door on one side for you to access the enclosure and a steel mesh ceiling on the top. That may leave you wondering, why not use a solid ceiling for these Pokemon? Well, not only will this allow fresh air into the enclosure, as well as make it cheaper in the long run, but a large part of these Pokemon's ecology is tied to the thunderstorms. So allowing the rain and thunder and lightning to enter the enclosure will actually do well for your Pokemon. Speaking of storms, you will also have to give your Pokemon some shelter from the elements if you happen to live in an area that gets cold and snows at any point during the year. These Pokemon do fine in the winter, especially the later evolutions with the heavier and thicker fur, but you will still have to have a place where they can go to rest and get out of the cold. Off the side of the enclosure, you should have a separate area that is much like a bedroom for them. There should be a bed, food dish, and other decorations and add-ons you want to add in for them. It will need to be insulated and heated, with lighting that can be turned on and off from the outside, and another door you can use to enter this part of the enclosure, and then a doorway that enters from this part into the rest of the enclosure. One that can also be shut to keep the heat in during the cold months. As for the sizes of the bedrooms, they should be about 5 feet square for Elekid, about 7 feet square for Electabuzz, and about 12 feet square for Electivire. 1.5 meters, 2.1 meters, and 3.7 meters respectively. That might seem small, but remember that this isn't really going to be a spot the Pokemon's going to be spending a lot of time in, and they may even decide that they prefer sleeping outside instead of coming in here, just to be closer to the sky and electricity sources. Before I talk about this next part of the enclosure, there is one thing I want to clear up about these Pokemon. These Pokemon have a bit of a reputation. Mostly Electabuzz, but the others tend to get the rep just because they're part of the same evolutionary line. These Pokemon are oftentimes blamed for the occurrence of blackouts in major cities, which, yes, it can and has happened. These Pokemon are drawn to large concentrations of electricity, and have been known to break into electrical plants to drink from the generators there, causing problems. But let me be very clear here. They are not the cause of all blackouts around the world. There are some regions that don't even have a native population of these guys. Unfortunately, it's become a common practice for companies to blame their failures on these Pokemon over the years, and that has stained the reputation of these Pokemon. Thankfully, the correct information has started to get out all over the world, but the main reason that I bring this up in this section of the guide is that it can really tell us about what some of the things they need in their enclosures are. They will need some form of electrical output in their enclosure for them to drink from. It doesn't have to be anything specific. You could realistically do anything from having outlets in the walls of the enclosure to even having generators in the center of the enclosure for them to pull from. The best ones that I've seen are ones that use the metal rods that we used in the Magnemite enclosure. Here, instead of being anchored to the walls, they're going to be situated on the ground, on top of a thick concrete pad that is at least 4 feet on all sides, 1.2 meters. This block will help to ground a lot of the power in the rod. From there, you'll have wires connected from the rod and run them underground to connect to either your home's power grid or to a separate power source. The wires will also need to be sheathed in rubber insulation to not only keep power from leaking out and shorting out the system, but also keeping the Pokemon from feeling the power coursing through them and digging them up. Through this method, your Pokemon will approach the rod and draw on it for electricity. As for how much electricity you want coursing through this thing, there are 2 schools of thought on that. One is to have a large burst of electricity all at once, much like how these Pokemon try to get struck by lightning during thunderstorms. It provides them a bunch of energy all at one time. The other method is a slow trickle of energy over a long period of time, as if they were feeding from a power generator and a power plant. Personally, I think that the second method is a better method for captivity. The burst method is done in the wild because lightning strikes are really the only natural sources of electricity that these Pokemon have access to. And when they do this, they tend to congregate in large numbers, dissipating that electrical strike through the entire group. Having just one of them take the whole thing can still overwhelm their system and cause damage. Using the slow feeding method, while yes, it does encourage a bit more of a sedentary lifestyle, also allows you better control over the flow of power to your Pokemon and prevents them from taking too much at once. We'll talk more about feedings and methods of feedings in the care section of the guide, but for now, just know that you should set these rods up to give off low amounts of power when they are powered, and you should have only one of them in the Elekid enclosure, and at least 2 or 3 of them for the later evolutions. This will provide not only a reason for your Pokemon to use their entire enclosure, but also give a bit of variety when they do feed. I feel I should mention this here, even though this enclosure section is going on for way too long. Electivire doesn't technically need these rods, or even the electrical charging spots at all. The evolution from Electabuzz actually fixed their electrical generation problem, allowing them to produce their own electricity and at very high amounts of power at that. Realistically, you could remove the rods we spoke of from an Electivire's enclosure if you wanted to. That would certainly save you on your electric bill, but you may not want to do that. The Pokemon, especially if you've kept it in that enclosure since it was an Elekid, has developed the habit of pulling on that electricity every day. Even if it has evolved and doesn't need it anymore, that doesn't mean that the habit won't be there. If you suddenly remove the rods from the enclosure, then the Pokemon may end up feeling distressed simply because its routine has been disrupted. It's really up to you if you decide to do this, but keep in mind you will have to do some extra training to get the Pokemon used to the idea that it doesn't need outside electrical sources anymore. As for other Pokemon that can be housed with them, you might want to avoid trying to house other species with them. This species has been known to get very territorial towards others, and if you end up trying to house them together, then it might start a fight and end up with one or both of the Pokemon involved getting hurt. Even other electric-type Pokemon wouldn't be a good idea, as they might try to pull the electricity out of them, which at best will cause an issue, and at worst might lead to the other Pokemon left with no energy at all. Really, it might be best to keep them with others of their own species. Thankfully, they don't have such a strong territorial response to each other, after all the dominance battles and dominance showing has settled down. While they don't have to be housed with other Elekid evolutions, they can do just well together, so long as they have enough space to get away from one another if they want to, and there's enough electricity and food to go around. It's when resources begin to get tight that problems can arise between members of the group. Always remember that the specifications I give in these guides are meant for single individuals unless otherwise stated, so be sure to change and expand things if you plan to add in more to the enclosure. Availability. The thing about these Pokemon is that they're exceedingly rare, to the point where most regions don't have a stable wild population of them, only random spottings here and there. They aren't endangered or anything, not like Kangaskhan, but they're certainly not all over the place either. In fact, the places where they're most common are in Alola, where they can be found on routes 12, Blush Mountain, and Mount Hakalani, and Galar, where they're found all over the Crown Tundra. Aside from those two regions, they can only be found in Johto on Route 10 and the Safari Zone, here in Sinnoh on Route 222, and in Unova in the Verbank Complex. All the other regions, Hoenn, Paldea, Kalos, and mainland Galar, have no natural population of these Pokemon. Funny enough, Kanto used to have a wild population of these Pokemon that lived in the old power plant that was there, but during the reclamation and refurbishing of the power plant, they were all either caught and sent elsewhere or driven away. Since then, there really hasn't been any wild Elekid evolutions in the Kanto region. And I think it goes without mention that if you are able to get to these places, then you're going to have a hard time finding one of them. Oh, and if you're thinking of getting a wild Electivire, then I suggest you think again. The electrolyzer that's used to facilitate the evolution is a solely man-made item, which I don't think has a wild counterpart. So unless you find an Electivire that some trainer released for some reason, or you find a Pokemon that has gone through a truly astounding amount of wild circumstances, then you're not going to find an Electivire in the wild. When we look at the breeding industry for these Pokemon, it's not the worst, but it's also not the best. These Pokemon, especially the later two evolutions, are decent in the battling scene, and while they aren't the most common Pokemon for people to have in the household, there are a decent amount of people that enjoy them. Not to mention that these guys are pretty easy to care for once you get the enclosure set up, and adding in more to the population doesn't mean you have to build a bunch of other enclosures all over the place. So, if you want to get a captive bred Elekid evolution, then I really don't think you should have any issues. The only thing is that if you want an Electivire right away, then it may be a bit more difficult, as then the breeder will need to go get their hands on an electrolyzer, which, as far as I'm aware, is more difficult to get than an evolution stone. They may not be willing to go through with all that, and if they are, then they're certainly going to charge you for it. Catchability. If you do decide to go after one of these Pokemon in the wild, then you had better be prepared. Not only do they tend to live in hard-to-get-to and dangerous places, but the Pokemon themselves are not exactly safe to be around. These Pokemon tend to live on the sides of mountains or in abandoned urban areas, which have their own dangers to those who aren't prepared, not to mention the latter might be illegal to enter altogether. Make sure you are prepared with the right gear, clothing, and emergency plans if something goes wrong. As for the Pokemon, they aren't the best at storing electricity once they get it. They tend to leak whatever power they get, to the point where Electabuzz has been known to glow with power in the dark. This means that trying to get too close to them is a very bad idea. Almost like getting tased, which isn't fun, let me tell you. I've gotten a few bad volts from my voltage and my dynamo, and I highly recommend you bring some shock-resistant clothing and a ground-type Pokemon with you, since that type isn't really affected by electricity. As for what Pokeballs to use, a Pokeball should be plenty strong enough for an Elekid, while you might want to use a Great Ball or even an Ultra Ball for an Electabuzz. And if, by one of Arceus' miracles, you do find a wild Electivire, then certainly use an Ultra Ball for that, and I'll be honest, even that might not be strong enough. Care. When I was looking into the diet needs of these Pokemon, it started to make sense why they adapted to use electricity to power some of their bodily functions, even when their bodies are terrible at storing it. This evolutionary line are herbivores, with the occasional addition of insects in their diet, but because of their size and habitat, there would be no way they could get all their needed dietary necessities from plants alone. They would be eating near constantly, and would strip mountains of their vegetation in weeks. Hence the adaptation to using electricity to compensate for some of that dietary scarcity. When you feed these Pokemon, you want to give them a mix of various fruits, the ones that have a good amount of water content in them, since this is where these Pokemon get the majority of their fluid intake, as well as a mixture of leafy, stem, and root veggies, about 65% and 30%, with the final 5% being some sort of protein, and honestly, even that 5% might be too much. The sugars in the fruit should promote the generation and flow of electricity in the Pokemon's body, while the fiber from the veggies and the protein should help to keep the Pokemon's body up and running well. As for how much to feed them, you want to give Elekid about 4 pounds of food over the course of a day, split into 3 different meals. Electabuzz will jump up to about 6.5 or 7 pounds of food, split into 2 meals a day. That might not seem like a lot, but you have to remember that while Electabuzz is taller than Elekid, it's actually not that much heavier and therefore has less mass to keep up to be healthy than a lot of other evolutions do. That changes, however, when it comes to Electivire. Electivire is such a big jump in size, muscle mass, and electrical generation and retention that even with the benefit of being able to absorb electricity from other sources, they require an immense amount of food. To sustain an Electivire, you have to feed them about 25 pounds of food a day, over the course of 3 meals a day to sustain that kind of body mass. It's an incredible amount of food, and remember, that's with a part of the dietary needs being taken up by the electrical absorption. Imagine what it could have been if they didn't have that adaptation. I will never stop saying this. Fully evolved Pokemon take up a lot of resources to keep. As for training, these Pokemon will come with certain issues. As for the first 2 evolutions, Elekid and Electabuzz, just being around them can be a hazard since they leak electricity. When working with them, you will need things such as shockproof clothing, rubber gloves, and other things that can protect you from that electrical discharge. Once that's covered, you can begin to work with them. For these Pokemon, you want to use a simple positive reinforcement method where if the Pokemon does something you like, then you give it something that it will enjoy, most commonly a treat of some kind. By repeating this action over and over, you will form a positive connection to that action in the Pokemon's mind, which means that the Pokemon is more likely to do that action in the future of their own accord. When you begin, if you got your Pokemon from the wild, then you will have to work on the Pokemon just being okay with you being near it. Like I said in the enclosure section, they can get fairly territorial, and even may see you as a potential rival. You will need to be very careful at this point using the introduction of food and slow, careful movements to get the Pokemon used to you being around it. I will say that this will be much easier, quicker, and safer if you start with Elekid. It usually doesn't have as much of a territorial instinct to it, and, more importantly, it has less ability to do you harm if it takes exception to you being there. That being said, always have their Pokeball on hand when you interact with these Pokemon just in case, and never enter their enclosure without your protective gear on. It is simply better that way for the both of you. And recognize that some wild Electabuzz may never warm up to you, as any wild Pokemon might. In those cases, you should only be entering the enclosure to clean and to feed them, and the Pokemon should be in their bowls while you do this. But if you got your Pokemon from a breeder, or you manage to catch one of the ones that are willing to be friendly towards you, then you can slowly work your way up from being allowed in the Pokemon space, to being allowed to get close to the Pokemon, and then eventually being able to touch and interact with the Pokemon directly. The observant of you might have noticed that I've only been talking about Elekid and Electabuzz when it comes to the training. And that's because when it comes to Electivire, it's a matter of it was either trained in the early evolutions, or it's not going to be trained. There isn't a lot of data on this because wild Electivire are so rare, but those that have been caught show that they may be too dangerous to train. Pokemon like this have been in the wild their entire lives, and, being an Electivire, it's most likely been the dominant Pokemon in its environment for a while, meaning that it's not going to just submit to a human's commands. If you end up getting a wild Electivire, then you have to treat it like it can't be trained, and only enter the enclosure when it is in its Pokeball. However, if the Electivire was well trained in its earlier evolutions, as they should be when coming from a breeder, then it's a completely different story. So long as your Electabuzz is trained for something, then your Electivire will be as well. That is realistically the only way that you're going to have an Electivire that you can directly interact with. Again, I'm going to reinforce this because this Pokemon has the ability to do a lot of damage to you and the surrounding area if it gets loosed in a populated place. Electabuzz must be trained before evolving. Otherwise, the training will not take. It is very important to remember that. Cost. I'm not gonna lie, the cheapest part of this whole thing might be the Pokemon. With how they can be housed together and the fact that the food needs aren't that bad, at least for the first two evolutions, the price isn't that bad either. Now, don't misunderstand me, it might not be the most expensive thing to breed these Pokemon, but it's also not cheap. The electric bill is going to go up, and they do take up quite a bit of time to train to be friendly towards people. Combine that with the fact that the later evolutions are very good for battlers looking for a decent electric type, and you're probably looking at the low category for Elekid and a moderate category for Electabuzz. As for Electivire, I can see it being anything from the moderate to the high category, depending on how expensive electrolyzers are in the breeder's area. Again, the food won't be terrible for the first two evolutions, but it also won't be super cheap either. Needing that much fruits and veggies is going to mean that you're going to have to start buying in bulk and freezing, or growing your own. But either way, it'll probably be at the different ends of the high category per month for Elekid and Electabuzz. And Electivire is going to be way into the high category. Let's be real here. These enclosures are simple, but they aren't going to be cheap, especially with how big the later two have to be. Add in how much bigger your electric bill is going to be, and, well, let's just say that the only one that I can see being less than the very high category is the Elekid enclosure, and even then, it's still going to be in the high category. Conclusion. In reality, the members of the Elekid line are some of those Pokemon that, if you put in the work and train them and care for them correctly, then they can be fine Pokemon. Well-mannered when trained, decent to interact with when trained, and they have some interesting quirks that I think some people would enjoy dealing with. But these are by no means beginner Pokemon. The electrical leakage alone makes them an intermediate level Pokemon at best. To me, it's best if the person that is caring for them has at least a bit of experience caring for Pokemon that either have some biological thing that makes them difficult to care for, or has dealt with the care of electric Pokemon before. If that happens to be you, and you're looking for another interesting electric type, then I can see these Pokemon being the perfect Pokemon partners for you. Thank you all for listening, and please join us again next time when we talk about the fiery volcano Pokemon Magby and its evolutions Magmar and Magmortar. Have a wonderful night, everyone.